Hello, good readers, and welcome to a truly tricky one. So, I would assume that everyone has at least heard of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. I can't imagine it's that widely read, but I'm sure we all at least think we know what it's about. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about Chaucer and what it is actually about, but first of all, I'll mention that I have been reading this book on and off since I was in my teens. And while I am this time listening to it in audio, I had this brilliant light bulb flash the other day. What if I could listen to Chaucer instead of fighting my way through the words? Now, the reason I've been reading it since I was a teenager is because of these. So this one is a Canterbury Tales new translation by Neville Coghill, and it's got that cellophane thing attached to it that has an actual name, sort of crinkly. Oh yes, and it's falling off. There's a name for this stuff. Jules Burt mentioned it on his channel. I've forgotten it. And this book has got my mother's initials on the inside of it, and I inherited it not too long ago when she died. This one is essentially the same edition, though they've got different numbers on the spines. This one is 122, I think, and this one I'm pretty sure was something else. Can't read it through the cellophane stuff. But this one on the inside says, to Hugh Roberts for his own, and in my mother's writing. So what I'm going to say is that this was my mum's copy and she liked it, and whenever she wanted to read it, she found that my dad had borrowed it. Now, my parents had an attitude to books that there was a book sharing element here, and for his own, I believe, is a reference to Lord of the Rings. In the Fellowship of the Rings, after Bilbo has his party and disappears, there's a whole heap of presents throughout his burrow to different friends and family. And on one of the umbrellas, there's a tag for his very own, which is a reference to the fact that the individual had borrowed many that were not his own and not returned them. So that, I think, was the sort of joke that my parents thought funny. As a consequence of having these around, I've been trying to read them for a very long time. They're not easy. They're not easy on adult me. They certainly weren't easy on 12 or 13-year-old me, which was the first time I remember picking them up and trying to mash my way through them. Those ones are translated and not in the original Middle English. Okay, so a few words about Chaucer. This time I'm listening to it in audiobook, and that's working for me quite well, because in the past I've always read bits and pieces, often out of sequence. I usually start with the prologue and then the beginning, but then skip around, because the contents as it's represented in these books talks about a group A, a group B, and then group C through to I of stories, and some of them are shorter than others and some of them are easier than others, so I never really read them in sequence. Chaucer was born in the 1300s at some stage in England. I don't think we know exactly when he was born, we didn't used to. And this was essentially an alien society to us. Mortality was enormous. There were bad things happening. It was the 100 Years' War, I believe, was still going on. The plague was happening in England at that time. It decimated the region. It killed off a major portion of the population. But Canterbury Tales don't really talk about any of those day-to-day disasters, and it's suggested that what Chaucer was trying to do with them is create stories that were just for fun. And what this is essentially is a short story collection, and you've got all the types of short stories. You've got humor, you've got sermons, you've got serious, some of them are vulgar, some of them are courtly, comic, true story style, everything is there. And it works really well because of the framing. This is one of these books of this era. There were a lot of books with framing. There was Dante was doing it. 1001 Nights did it. Basically, the frame is the important part of this one. But because of these stories, Chaucer got labelled as the father of modern English literature. and that is because he wrote it in Middle English. Now Chaucer was well educated. He knew Latin, which was a official courtly language. He knew Italian. We know that because he was an ambassador and travelled to Italy. He knew French, which was another one of the official languages of England. Middle English was a peasant's language, and he wrote these stories in that language, justifying, validating the fact that for many people this was the language they spoke in. So that was important, and I think that's why some people call him the father of modern English. Okay, back to Chaucer, who was born in the 1300s. There is a first record of him in the 1300s when he's a page in the household of a high family that brought him into contact with the court. And I think he actually married someone who was the daughter, niece, sister, something or other of an official at court, which was how he himself ended up at court and working for court for many decades. Including being... His life was fascinating, by the way. I would absolutely read a story about his life. He got sent all over Europe. He got involved in the sidelines on the war and actually became a war hostage. He was hijacked by highwaymen when he was on business for the king, carrying the king's monies. Fascinating life. We first know about him when he's entered in the accounts that were kept for the household where he was a page, and we know that he was issued striped pantaloons, trousers, and a pair of shoes and a cape. So in that house we know he would have received an upper class education. The class system of the 1300s is something that I don't understand for England. I've read just enough about it to know that I really don't understand much about it, that it was far more complicated than you would ever believe, and very, very interesting. I do like reading about it. Now, Chaucer retired in, if I'm not mistaken, 1387, at which stage he started writing this, and it was a very ambitious project because of the framing, which is one of the things that makes it most interesting, I think, to a modern reader. He foresaw all these people travelling on pilgrimage to Canterbury, each telling 2 tales when they went up to Canterbury and 2 tales as they came back. But Chaucer died in 1400 without having written all the tales. Now, here's the bit that I've always loved. The pilgrimage starts in a tavern. Okay, who out there ever played D&D when it was tabletop instead of a computer game? How does the GM get all the thieves and the clerics and maybe even a knight? How does he get them all together? In a tavern. You meet in a tavern before you go on your first quest, right? Well, my first D&D didn't, but most of them do, and many of the other ones I've played did. So the fact that Chaucer has his pilgrims meeting in a tavern is supreme. And I do actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's a real tavern that exists. The Tabard Inn? Is it called I think it's called the Tabard Inn. So there's an element of realism there. Anyway, they meet there, and their host suggests that they entertain each other on this long, long journey of, I think it ended up being 2 or 3 days by road, by telling these tales, and that whoever told the tale that the company most enjoyed would be treated by the company to a meal on their return to the Tabard Inn. And so you've got all these completely disparate tales, and it is as believable a framework for them being told as you can imagine. Now, in terms of history, pilgrimage then meant something a bit different to what we in 2020s might think of it as meaning. Yes, there was a religious connotation, and I really don't understand how religion worked in the 1300s. 13 through to 1600s, it was all pretty murky. But a couple of things I do know. In order to travel the roads, you need the king's permission. You couldn't just go, oh, I'm going to travel from the Gold Coast up to Brisbane to visit my cousin. You couldn't just decide to get up from Melbourne and go for a day's travel down the road to Adelaide. No, you needed the king's permission to travel the roads, which were dangerous. There were highwaymen, there was a whole heap of stuff. And while wealthy people had the means and resources, a lot of other people had essentially no holiday. A pilgrimage was their chance at holiday, or so some of the sources I've read about say. So that puts the pilgrimage in a completely different light, and it puts the people who are traveling on the pilgrimage in a completely different light as well. And their stories relate to them very strongly. But like I said, for 2020's reader, probably the most exciting thing is the framing. So you've got the prologue that talks about who they are, introducing the different characters. And then you've got the characters themselves that talk about a bit about themselves before and after their tale. Then you've got the tale itself. Then you've got the company weighing in on what the tale is worth and whether they liked it or not. And on one occasion here, completely cancelling the tale. So this is history as written by the person who is in the history, writing it for entertainment. So it's very special in that way. It is so hard to read. You read a book like this or listen to it and you realise just how coddled we are in the 2020s, just how much you can't write. This is essentially meant to be a satire, estate satire, might be called, I'm not sure. But while it is very satirical and at times very funny, at times it's utterly horrifying to the modern reader, and at times it's completely comprehensible. I'm sure there's whole books out there on how to interpret different things, and the translation matters a lot, because I like Neville Coggle's translation. It means that I can actually understand what I'm reading. For example, The Knight's Tale in its fourth part. Great was the festival they held that day in Athens in the lusty month time of May. You try reading that in Middle English, it'll take you a while. Worth it, but tricky. And half the time you don't know what you're reading. Okay. So I am 50% through this whopping 1,000 and a few hundred odd audiobook. The audio is longer than my paperbacks. I thought I'd supplement the audio with the paperbacks when I wasn't sure what I was hearing, and that works in some of them, but this has been abridged to an extent that you've got a whole extra 1,000 odd lines in the audio. 1,000 lines. Astronomical. Anyway, so what do I think of it so far? The prologue is fine and I enjoyed it. We start with The Knight's Tale. I've read The Knight's Tale a number of times over the year. I love it. Always have loved it. In general, I mostly understand it. He's telling a story about a love story, a mythological love story about two Greek men who were fighting in the wars and were taken into captivity, and they fell in love with the sister-in-law of the king, and how all that resulted. The actual story is fantastic, and the knight was an interesting character. I've heard that the tales are meant to be told in order of seniority, and the knight in their particular class system was the most senior, so he went first. The words in between, the framing for the Knight's Tale, is fascinating. But then we have the Miller's Tale, and I believe that went out of sequence because the miller was so drunken and ribald that he just shoved in, even though socially speaking he should have been way down the pecking order. The Miller's Tale is grand. It is a bit more earthy, much less courtly, but it offended the reeve, who goes next. And so the framing between the miller and the reeve is really good when they're basically knocking points off each other with their stories. And yeah, the reeve's tale is funny, and the one after it was incomplete. And then you've got the Man of Law, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And then you've got another one. Who was the one after the Man of Law? I think they're in the same sequence still here. Miller's Tale, the Reeves prologue. Oh yeah, so you've got the prologue and then you've got the actual tale. And the prologue is the fascinating bit quite often. There we go, the Cook's prologue and the Cook's Tale. The Cook was even more socially low than the Miller. Though these weren't serfs, they were still low, and I found it quite fascinating. Then you've got the introduction to the Man of Law's Tale, The Man of Law's prologue of The Man of Law's Tale, and epilogue of The Man of Law's Tale. Then you had The Shipman. The Shipman was awesome, actually. I don't seem to have made any notes about that, but I thoroughly enjoyed it up to here. And to here, I have made it quite often. And then you've got Words of the Host to the Shipman and the Prioress, where they're talking about the stories they've heard so far, and the Prioress goes next. The Prioress is where I have stuck in the past. Because no matter how often I've read it, and no matter how many times I have DNF'd it, I forget how racist it is. It is hugely anti-Semitic. It is exceptionally nasty. It is an exceptional tale, which, if you want to read something that really shakes you to the marrow of how different we are now to the 1300s, it will get you there, because the things that they're talking about as moral and correct are so far from where our baseline is that it's hard to understand what's happening. There's also this nauseatingly saccharine element of this wonderful and noble and oh so nice child, which is look, I could talk for a long time about it, and there's an excellent chance that YouTube would actually not like that, so I won't. Right, so next we go for two tales that are unique in that they are apparently the only tales that are told in this book by Chaucer. All the others told by the prioress, the knight, the miller, the cook, a whole heap of other people. But first of all, he starts telling the story of Saint Topaz. And I was actually quite enjoying it. I'm not sure if I've read Saint Topaz before, or is it Tophas? Topaz? One of them things. And I was quite enjoying it. It's quite earthy, but apparently the host interrupts Chaucer telling that, as it's a vulgar tale and they want him to tell them something more highbrow. I don't think it's any more vulgar than the earlier farce where a man is being cuckolded by another man who's sleeping with his wife while he's drunk, expecting Noah's flood to come again, and then this swain of hers comes to the window and kisses a part of her that is nowhere near where he thought he was be kissing. Apparently that was fine, but St. Topaz's tale, no. So Chaucer stops and starts with the tale of Melibea. Or Meliboeus, I'm not sure which one it is. And this is the one that was left out of the main translation. Apparently it's left out of many translations because it is over 1,000 lines long, and it feels like 1,000 hours of agony because it is really, really odd. It is moralistic, it is preachy, it is tedious. And the way it is Melibea or Meliboeus is a fairly well-to-do man living in his house. He's got this lovely daughter who everyone adores. She's nice to look at. She's humble like women are meant to be. She's obedient. She's all the good things. And his wife is named Prudence. They're all living happily together until some thieves put a ladder against the window, which seems strangely specific to me, climb in the dead of night, and they do horrible, horrible things to his daughter. They do such horrible things that she's like to dead, and they finish it off by stabbing her 5 times. She's not quite dead. And he brings in physicians. And then he calls on all his friends and neighbours to talk about how he's going to get vengeance on these people who did these horrible things to his daughter. Now, this is where, to a modern reader, it goes horror-shaped. Because Dame Prudence, his wife, is essentially arguing him out of taking any sort of revenge on these horrible people who did horrible things to his daughter. And she does it at great length, by quoting every single source ever heard of. Seneca, Solomon, every other person in the Bible, Old Testament, every other person in the New Testament, and then more Seneca, and then several other ones that I had to look up. I'd never heard of them. So basically you've got this line like, taking revenge is bad because Seneca said this and Solomon said that. And so basically this woman has just had her daughter completely and utterly mutilated to the point of death. But she doesn't think that her husband should do anything about that. In fact, the poor daughter is mentioned in the beginning as the reason for all this horrific narration. And I think once or twice others she's mentioned in passing. But eventually Dame Prudence wreaks her will on her poor, long-suffering husband Melibœus by telling him that as his name is Melibœus, which is the word for sweet honey wine, and he's too happy in life and drinking too much sweet honey wine and too comfortable and has too much wealth, because of that, it's somehow his fault that God sent these horrible things to happen to his daughter. Which is where I come back to saying that what they thought religion was in the 1300s is a little bit tricky to modern ears. So for the first third of this, I was angry with what I was hearing. I would often pause it, grumble, whine, complain about it. By the middle, I was sort of battened into submission and I was just putting up with it. But somewhere in the last third of this, it just started moving me to helpless laughter. It was so ludicrous. It was so moralistic. It was so quoted. It's like 3 words of subject followed by one whole paragraph of quotations. I was just laughing hysterically and helplessly at this thing. At the end, of course, Dame Prudence manages to convince Melibœus that a nice saccharine pardon of these horrible persons is called for. No further mention is made of his daughter, who's doubtless shamed forever and probably will end up begging in the street. I chose to engage with this book that was written in the 1300s. What can I say? So, I have the horror. It's hysterically funny. You can't not laugh. But the scary thing about it is that I'm reasonably certain that to Chaucer, all of that made good sense, and he was airing his learning by being able to quote all these sources. And I feel like to many of his readers, the moralistic element would also have made good sense, which is just quite terrifying. This is one of those culture shocks. Hey, when I was young, before the internet, I went on a trip to Indonesia and I ended up in the slums of, was it Yogyakarta or Denpasar? I can't remember. In these slums. That was less of a culture shock than Melibœus' tale was. I kind of liked it. Eventually, I kind of liked it. So anyway, having managed to make my way through Melibœus' tale more or less intact, we moved on eventually to what happened after Melibœus. Oh yes, so we had the Monk's Tale. The Monk's Tale was actually really interesting in that all it did was tell stories from different sources. So you've got Lucifer's story. I think Lucifer's more interesting than the monk makes it out to be, but you never mind. You've got Adam, Samson, Hercules, Nebuchadnezzar, and a whole heap of other ones. The Viscount of Lombardy was an odd one. Count Ugolino of Pisa, Julius Caesar, and a few other ones. And all of these stories are basically telling the host stories that they already know. Kind of like Disney telling us Sleeping Beauty over and over again. Or is it? No, Beauty and the Beast over and over again. A bit like that. And one thing I read said that Chaucer's tales were very much meant to be entertainment, and people didn't want to be entertained by new things. They wanted to be entertained by new tellings of stories they already know, which is what the Monk's Tale was. And there's an interesting little framing after that where the words of the knight and the host on the Monk's Tale were given. Then we go on to the nun's priest's tale. And I still haven't figured out what a nun's priest is. Or priest's nun. I don't get it. I couldn't understand what it was. I forgot to Google it before this review. Maybe I'll remember before the next one. And that one was a bit mystifying. I did quite like it, but didn't quite get it. Then we've got the physician's tale, words from the host to the physician and the pardoner. Then the pardoner's prologue and the pardoner's tale is where I'm at the moment. The pardoner is a really, really weird concept once again to us, or at least to me, in this country and this century. So as well as having priests and church and all that sort of stuff, you had licensed pardoners who apparently could pardon people without being churchmen. They could also sell holy relics, which apparently is how they made their money. And this pardoner boasts of preaching where he wasn't allowed to preach, and of rooking people by selling them glass shards and other nonsense as holy relics. And he says this openly to the host. I've got this wide range of things I can sell you, bones, which have all come from, what was it, geese? Anyway, he honestly and openly says that he's rooking people of their money to buy these relics. Relics were a big thing. It sounds like a thoroughly amoral character, and I feel like there's a lot more one could understand from the Pardoner's Tale if one knew more history of this era, which I don't. So that's the end of what Neville Coghill is calling Group C, and I'm currently finishing off the Pardoner's Tale, and the next is The Wife of Bath. The Wife of Bath is probably one of the most famous ones. There's a prologue, then the tale, and I know that The Wife of Bath, with her tale, is claimed by some to be a feminist narrative and some to be an anti-feminist narrative. Some people say it's a strong, independent woman living her life, doing her thing, and others say otherwise. I have read that one before, but it was so long ago I couldn't tell you a thing about it. I'm looking forward to getting to it. Wow. The Canterbury Tales. At this rate, if there wasn't a large road trip ahead of me, I might still be listening to this by the end of the year. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. Now, is it for you? Well, if you've watched this far, you've probably formed your own opinions, and well, you should. If you like reading literature from the 1300s, I don't know where you got the rest of it, but if you like reading stuff like this from the source rather than books about it, then yeah, I think it's probably for you. Maybe skip and choose. Maybe read one here and one there. Maybe don't read all the way through like I am. It's a bit undigestible in that way. There are people and books out there that will help you read it in the Middle English if you want a true challenge, or if you're a historical reenactor of English motifs, then that would probably be very interesting for you. If you've got a real fascination about modern Christian religion and its manifestations over the era, I think there's a lot here that would be for you. If you want to read books that you understand and are just fun without wanting to yell at them in fury, this one might not be for you. If you want easy reading, if you want fun reading. Is it science fiction? Absolutely not. Is it weird? I don't think it gets much weirder. So, read it or not. I hope to come back and review the last part of it for you. But whether you read it or not, you know you should always read good books.